The old wooden porch creaked gently beneath Thomas Walker's chair as he leaned back and watched the slow fading of the evening light. Autumn had painted the trees beyond his small house with deep shades of amber and rust, and the breeze carried the soft scent of fallen leaves across the yard. At 78, Thomas had grown used to these quiet hours. They were his favorite part of the day, when the world seemed to slow down and memories could drift through his mind like clouds across a calm sky. A wool blanket rested over his knees, and beside him sat a small wooden table holding a cup of warm tea that had already begun to cool. From where he sat, he could see the old gravel road that passed by the property. Though it rarely welcomed more than the occasional passing car or bicycle. Silence, gentle and unhurried, had become his closest companion over the years. Yet in that silence lived many memories, some bright and soft like morning sunlight, others distant and shadowed like hills beyond the horizon. Thomas did not often speak about the years he had spent in uniform. Those stories remained mostly within him, folded carefully like old letters kept in a drawer. But on evenings like this one, when the sky turned violet and the first stars appeared above the quiet countryside, the past seemed to return with a calm persistence. He remembered the sound of boots on gravel during early mornings long ago. The quiet laughter of young men sharing coffee before sunrise, and the steady rhythm of days that once felt endless. Strange, he thought, how those days now seemed like brief pages in a very long book. The war had taken place more than half a century ago, yet it still visited him gently from time to time, never loudly, never harshly, just a quiet presence reminding him of the road he had once walked. A pair of sparrows fluttered onto the porch railing and chirped softly before settling down for the night. Thomas watched them with a faint smile, his eyes calm and thoughtful. The world had changed so much since he was young, yet small things remained the same, the coolness of evening air, the steady ticking of time, and the comfort of simple moments. As darkness slowly gathered across the fields, Thomas lifted his tea and took a slow sip. Somewhere far away, a train whistle echoed across the countryside, low and distant. The sound carried him gently back through the years, to a time when he himself had once stood on a train platform with a small bag in his hand and a future he could not yet imagine. And though he did not yet realize it, that memory would be the first to return tonight, opening the quiet door to a long journey through the stories he had carried within him for so many years. The memory arrived softly, like the slow rolling of fog across a quiet field, and Thomas found himself once again standing on the small train platform of his hometown many decades earlier. It had been an early morning in late spring, the kind when the air still carried the coolness of night while the first pale sunlight stretched across the rooftops. Back then he had been just 19 years old, tall and lean, with a suitcase that felt heavier than it really was. Around him, the platform had been filled with quiet conversations, nervous laughter, and the occasional long embrace between families who knew that goodbyes could last longer than expected. The station itself had been modest. Built of old red bricks and shaded by a wide oak tree whose branches reached over part of the platform like a protective hand. Thomas remembered watching the leaves move gently in the breeze while the distant whistle of the approaching train slowly grew louder. At the time, he had felt a strange mixture of emotions, curiosity, determination, and a quiet uncertainty that he tried not to show. His mother had stood beside him wearing her favorite blue coat, though the morning was not particularly cold. She had held his arm for a long time without saying much, as if words were not strong enough to carry everything she wished to tell him. His father, a man of few expressions, had simply placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder and given a small nod that carried more meaning than any speech. Nearby, other young men waited with similar suitcases and similar thoughts, their faces reflecting the same quiet courage that often appears when people step toward the unknown. When the train finally arrived, its great engine breathing clouds of steam into the cool air, the platform briefly filled with motion. Conductors called out instructions, luggage shifted from hand to hand, and families shared their last hurried words before the doors closed. Thomas remembered climbing the metal steps into the carriage and turning back for one last look. His mother waved with a brave smile that shimmered slightly in the morning light, while his father lifted his hat in a slow, respectful gesture. As the train began to move, the station gradually slipped away behind him, shrinking until it became only a small shape beside the long silver tracks. Inside the carriage, the rhythmic clatter of wheels soon settled into a steady pattern, almost soothing in its repetition. Some of the young men talked quietly while others stared out the windows, each lost in private thoughts about where the rails might lead them. Thomas had watched the countryside glide past, the farms, the rivers, the distant barns, and wondered how much of the world he was about to see. He did not yet know the friendships he would form, the challenges he would face, or the memories that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But as the train carried them steadily toward the horizon, he felt something calm growing within him, like the quiet understanding that every journey begins with a single step, or perhaps with the gentle rolling of wheels along a long and patient track. The train journey had lasted nearly a full day, carrying Thomas and the other young recruits far beyond the familiar landscapes of their hometowns, until at last it arrived at a wide station near the military training grounds. Thomas still remembered stepping down from the carriage and feeling the warm afternoon sun on his face, along with the quiet realization that life had already begun to change. A line of green trucks waited outside the station, their engines humming softly as soldiers guided the new arrivals toward them with calm but steady voices. The ride to the base was short but silent, as most of the recruits simply looked out at the long open fields that surrounded the camp. When they finally arrived, Thomas saw rows of simple wooden barracks stretching across the land, along with tall flagpoles and wide training fields that shimmered in the heat of the afternoon. Everything seemed orderly, almost carefully arranged, as though the entire place had been built to teach discipline through its very shape. The first days passed quickly, filled with early mornings and long hours of learning new routines. Each sunrise arrived with the clear sound of a bugle echoing through the camp, gently but firmly calling everyone to begin the day. Thomas soon learned how to fold his blanket with precise corners, how to march in step with the others across the gravel paths, and how to listen closely to the calm instructions of the instructors who guided them. At first, everything felt unfamiliar, the heavy boots, the rhythm of drills, the strict schedule that shaped each hour, but gradually these things began to feel natural, like habits slowly settling into place. The recruits came from many different towns and cities, and during quiet moments they shared stories about home, families, and the small details of the lives they had left behind. In the evenings, when the training finally ended, some of them would sit on the steps outside the barracks and watch the sunset spread warm colors across the wide sky. Thomas often found himself listening more than speaking. Learning the personalities of the men around him, Daniel, who had a deep laugh that carried across the yard, Michael, who liked to sketch small drawings in a notebook whenever he had a moment of rest, and quiet Robert, who spoke little but always offered a thoughtful nod when someone needed encouragement. Slowly, A quiet sense of friendship began to grow among them, formed not through grand moments but through small shared experiences, passing a canteen during a hot afternoon drill, helping someone adjust a heavy pack, or simply exchanging tired smiles at the end of a long day. One evening, after weeks of training had passed, Thomas stood alone near the edge of the field as dusk settled gently over the camp. The sky glowed with deep shades of orange and purple while the first evening stars began to appear. In that quiet moment, he realized that the uncertainty he had felt on the train had begun to fade. The days ahead were still unknown, but he no longer felt that he faced them alone. Around him were men who had begun as strangers but were slowly becoming something closer to brothers, and within that growing bond Thomas felt a steady calm that would quietly guide him through many of the days still waiting beyond the horizon. As the weeks of training continued, the rhythm of life at the camp became steady and predictable, almost like the slow turning of seasons. Each day followed a familiar pattern of drills, lessons, and long walks across the wide training fields, but it was the evenings that Thomas remembered most clearly. When the sun dipped below the distant hills and the air cooled, the barracks slowly filled with the quiet sounds of boots being set aside, lockers closing softly, and tired voices exchanging the simple stories of the day. The wooden building itself was plain and practical, with rows of narrow beds and small windows that allowed the last golden light of sunset to stretch across the floor. For many of the young men, those calm hours before sleep became a small island of comfort in the middle of demanding days. Thomas often sat on the edge of his bed, polishing his boots or folding his uniform while listening to the conversations around him drift gently through the room. Daniel's deep laugh was usually the first to appear, followed by Michael's quiet jokes or Robert's thoughtful remarks that often made the others pause and nod. Sometimes the men spoke about their homes, the small towns where they had grown up, the favorite meals their families cooked, or the quiet places they liked to walk before life carried them here. Those conversations were never hurried. They moved slowly, like a peaceful river, allowing everyone a moment to remember the familiar parts of life that still waited far away. On certain evenings, Michael would take out his small sketchbook and begin drawing the room around them, the rows of beds, the boots beneath them, or the simple lantern that hung from the ceiling. His drawings were quick but gentle, capturing the calm expressions of tired soldiers preparing for rest. Occasionally he would show the sketches to the others, and a quiet smile would pass through the group as they recognized themselves in the soft lines of pencil. Thomas once asked why he liked drawing so much, and Michael had simply shrugged and said that sometimes a picture helped him hold on to moments that might otherwise slip away. That answer stayed with Thomas for many years. Some nights the wind moved softly outside the barracks, brushing the wooden walls with a sound like distant waves. Other nights were so still that the quiet breathing of the sleeping men became the only rhythm in the room. Thomas often lay awake for a few minutes before sleep, watching the dim shadows on the ceiling and thinking about the path that had led him there. Strangely, he felt a growing sense of peace during those moments. Though the future remained uncertain, the friendships forming around him created a quiet strength that made each new day easier to face. And as the lantern light slowly dimmed and sleep settled gently over the barracks, Thomas would close his eyes with the calm understanding that these quiet evenings, simple and unremarkable as they seemed, would one day become some of the memories he treasured most. One afternoon, several months into their training, the camp mail truck arrived with its usual quiet rumble along the dusty road, and the small gathering of soldiers near the barracks instantly became more attentive. Mail days were never loud or dramatic, but they carried a gentle excitement that spread quietly through the camp. Letters from home were small bridges to another world, the world of familiar kitchens, peaceful streets, and family voices that seemed far away yet somehow close again when written on paper. Thomas stood with the others as a corporal calmly called out names, handing each envelope to its owner with a brief nod. When Thomas finally heard his name and received the thin cream-colored letter, he immediately recognized his mother's careful handwriting. He held it for a moment before opening it, almost as if he wanted to stretch the moment slightly longer. Then he walked to a quiet bench beneath a tall elm tree near the edge of the training field and slowly unfolded the paper. The letter was simple and warm, filled with gentle descriptions of everyday life back home. His mother wrote about the small vegetable garden behind the house, which had grown especially well that summer, and about the old neighbor who still waved each morning while watering his roses. She mentioned that the town bakery had begun selling a new kind of bread that his father liked, and she even described how the stray orange cat that often wandered through their yard had finally allowed her to pet it. None of the details were extraordinary, yet reading them filled Thomas with a deep and steady comfort. The words carried the calm rhythm of home, reminding him that life continued peacefully in the places he had once known so well. At the end of the letter, his mother wrote a few lines that he would remember for many years. She told him not to worry about anything beyond doing his best each day, and that wherever life might lead him, he would always carry a piece of home within him. Thomas folded the letter carefully after reading it twice, placing it back into the envelope with quiet appreciation. Around him, other soldiers were doing much the same, some smiling softly, others sitting in thoughtful silence as they reread familiar handwriting. Even Daniel, whose laughter usually filled the barracks, seemed unusually calm as he leaned against a tree with a letter from his younger sister. For a while the entire training ground felt peaceful, as though the distant voices of families had briefly traveled across the miles to sit beside them. As the afternoon sun slowly drifted westward and the bugle eventually called everyone back to their duties, Thomas placed the letter safely inside his pocket. He knew that difficult days might still lie ahead, but the warmth of those written words would stay with him, like a small lantern quietly glowing in the corner of his mind, ready to offer comfort whenever the road ahead felt long or uncertain. Not long after the summer had begun to fade, quiet rumors started to move through the camp like a soft wind across tall grass. The soldiers sensed that their training period was nearing its end, and although no one spoke about it loudly, everyone understood that the next stage of their journey would soon begin. One early morning, before the sun had fully risen, the recruits were instructed to gather their belongings and prepare for travel. Trucks once again lined the dusty road outside the camp, their engines murmuring patiently as the men climbed aboard with their packs. Thomas remembered the cool morning air and the pale silver light stretching across the open fields as they drove away from the training grounds that had slowly become familiar to them. The journey led them to a large harbor where a massive ship waited quietly beside the long wooden pier. Its tall structure rose above the water like a floating city, and the gentle movement of the sea created soft reflections of the early sky across its dark surface. For many of the soldiers, it was the first time they had seen such a vessel up close. The harbor itself was calm and orderly, filled with the slow sounds of ropes being secured, footsteps along the docks, and distant gulls gliding above the water. As Thomas walked up the long ramp and stepped onto the deck, he felt the subtle motion of the ship beneath his boots, a steady rocking that reminded him they were about to leave solid ground behind. The voyage that followed lasted many days, though time seemed to move differently on the open sea. Each morning began with the soft glow of sunrise spreading across the endless water, while the ship carried them steadily toward a destination few of them had ever seen. Some of the soldiers spent hours leaning against the railings, watching the waves roll endlessly past the hull. Others passed the time writing letters or quietly talking about the places they hoped to see once their duty was complete. Thomas often stood at the edge of the deck during the quieter hours, listening to the low hum of the ship's engines and the rhythmic splash of water against its sides. The vastness of the ocean created a strange kind of calm. As if the world had briefly become simpler and wider all at once. Evenings on the ship were particularly peaceful. After supper, many of the men gathered on the upper deck where the sky stretched above them like an enormous dark canvas scattered with stars. Far from the lights of cities, the night sky appeared brighter than Thomas had ever seen before. Sometimes Daniel would point out familiar constellations, while Michael tried to sketch the endless horizon in his notebook, though he often admitted that no drawing could fully capture the quiet beauty of the sea at night. During those calm hours, the soldiers spoke more thoughtfully about the days ahead, not with fear but with a quiet understanding that their lives were moving into a new chapter. And as the ship continued its steady voyage across the gentle waves, Thomas felt that same quiet sense of purpose growing within him again, the feeling that, whatever awaited them beyond the horizon, they would face it together, step by step, just as they had done since the day they first arrived at the training grounds. After many calm days on the open water, the ship finally began to slow as it approached a distant shoreline that slowly rose from the morning mist. Thomas remembered standing at the railing beside the others as the pale light of dawn revealed a quiet harbor surrounded by low hills and small clusters of buildings. The journey across the ocean had created a strange feeling among the soldiers, as though they had drifted into a different world where everything felt both new and uncertain. Yet the harbor itself appeared peaceful, with fishing boats rocking gently near the docks and seabirds circling lazily above the water. When the ship finally settled against the pier and the long ramp was lowered, the soldiers gathered their gear and stepped down onto land once again, feeling the solid ground beneath their boots after so many days at sea. The air smelled faintly of salt and distant pine trees, and a cool breeze moved across the harbor as trucks waited to carry them toward their next destination. The drive from the harbor led through quiet countryside where narrow roads curved between green fields and small villages. Thomas watched the landscape carefully from the back of the truck, noticing the unfamiliar shapes of rooftops, the quiet farms resting beneath gentle hills, and the distant church towers that appeared now and then above the trees. Eventually the convoy arrived at a modest military camp located just beyond a small forest. Compared to the training base back home, this camp felt simpler and more temporary, with canvas tents standing in neat rows and wooden supply sheds scattered around the edges of the clearing. Though the surroundings were new, the routines quickly began to resemble those they had already learned. The soldiers unpacked their equipment, arranged their sleeping areas, and slowly adjusted to the quiet rhythm of life in this distant place. During the first few days, much of their time was spent preparing, organizing supplies, and learning the layout of the nearby roads and hills. Nothing felt rushed. The officers spoke calmly and moved with careful patience, guiding the men as they became familiar with the new environment. In the evenings, when their duties were finished, many of the soldiers would walk a short distance beyond the tents to a small rise overlooking the valley. From there they could see the lights of a nearby village beginning to glow as night settled across the countryside. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, and sometimes the faint sound of a church bell drifted through the cool air. Those moments reminded Thomas that life continued peacefully in many places beyond the camp, even while the soldiers quietly prepared for the responsibilities ahead. One evening, as the sky faded into deep shades of blue and silver, Thomas sat with Daniel, Michael, and Robert on the grassy hill. None of them spoke for a while. They simply watched the distant lights flicker on one by one across the valley below. In that quiet silence, Thomas felt something steady and reassuring. Though they were far from home, the familiar presence of his friends beside him created a calm sense of belonging. The world around them was wide and uncertain, but the quiet strength they shared made the unfamiliar landscape feel a little less distant, like the beginning of another chapter slowly unfolding beneath the peaceful evening sky. As the days passed in the new camp beyond the sea, life settled into a slower and more thoughtful rhythm. The soldiers spent many hours traveling along the nearby roads, learning the quiet countryside that surrounded their temporary home. These journeys were not hurried. They often involved long walks or short rides in trucks that moved steadily through the rolling hills and narrow valleys. Thomas grew familiar with the winding dirt paths that passed through small forests of tall pine trees and the stone bridges that crossed gentle streams flowing toward the distant river. The land itself seemed calm and patient, as though it had been watching travelers pass for many generations. On one particular afternoon, Thomas and a small group of soldiers were assigned to follow a narrow road that curved along the edge of a wide meadow. The sky above them was soft and pale, with thin clouds drifting slowly across the horizon. The quiet of the countryside felt almost peaceful, broken only by the distant sound of birds and the steady rhythm of boots touching the ground. Daniel walked a few steps ahead, occasionally pointing out interesting shapes in the clouds, while Michael carried his sketchbook tucked carefully inside his jacket in case he found a moment worth drawing. Robert, as usual, walked quietly beside Thomas, his calm presence offering silent companionship along the path. After some time, the road led them to a small village resting near the base of the hills. The houses were built from pale stone, their red roofs glowing warmly in the afternoon sunlight. Though the soldiers moved respectfully through the village, a few curious residents appeared at windows or doorways, watching the visitors with quiet interest. An elderly man sitting on a wooden bench outside a small shop lifted his hand in a gentle greeting as the group passed by, and Thomas returned the gesture with a polite nod. In that brief moment, Thomas felt a simple connection that reminded him how similar people could be, even across great distances and different languages. The soldiers paused for a short rest near a fountain in the center of the village square. Clear water flowed steadily into a round basin, its soft sound creating a peaceful pause in the afternoon. Michael quickly took out his sketchbook and began capturing the scene, the fountain, the quiet houses, and the distant hills rising beyond the rooftops. Daniel leaned against the stone edge of the fountain while Robert sat calmly on a nearby step, watching the slow movement of clouds above them. For Thomas, the moment felt strangely calm, almost like a memory forming even as it happened. Soon the group continued along the road, leaving the village behind as the sun slowly lowered toward the hills. The light grew warmer, casting long shadows across the fields as the soldiers walked back toward their camp. Though their duties would continue in the days ahead, that quiet afternoon remained with Thomas for many years. It reminded him that even during uncertain times, the world still held gentle places where ordinary life moved forward with patience and quiet grace, like a peaceful road winding softly through the hills beneath the fading golden light of evening. As summer slowly faded into early autumn, the countryside around the camp began to change in quiet and beautiful ways. The green hills that had greeted the soldiers when they first arrived gradually turned warm shades of gold and amber, and the cool evening air carried the soft scent of fallen leaves. Thomas often noticed these small changes during the calm moments of each day, especially when the sun dipped low and long shadows stretched across the valley. Time had moved gently during those months, marked not by dramatic events but by steady routines and quiet friendships that had grown stronger with each passing week. By now, the men knew the nearby roads well. They could walk the familiar paths almost without thinking. Recognizing the shape of distant hills and the sound of the small river that curved through the valley below the camp. The little village they had once visited had become a friendly landmark along their occasional patrol routes. Sometimes the same elderly man still sat on the bench near the shop, lifting his hand in greeting as the soldiers passed by. These simple encounters created a quiet sense of connection, reminding Thomas that even far from home, kindness and calm understanding could still be found. During the cooler evenings, the soldiers often gathered outside their tents after supper. A small lantern usually rested on a wooden crate between them, casting a warm circle of light that gently pushed back the darkness. Daniel's familiar laugh still rose now and then, though it had softened slightly over time, as if even his cheerful spirit had learned to move more thoughtfully. Michael continued to fill pages of his sketchbook, capturing the hills, the tents, and the peaceful skies that stretched endlessly above them. Robert remained the quiet observer of the group, offering a few thoughtful words when they mattered most. For Thomas, these evenings felt like calm islands of reflection in the middle of their long journey. One particular night stayed clearly in his memory. The sky was unusually clear, and the stars shone with bright, steady light above the silent valley. A faint breeze moved through the grass, creating a soft whisper that blended with the distant sound of the river below the hill. The soldiers sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in quiet thoughts about the paths their lives had taken. Thomas found himself thinking about the train station where his journey had begun so many months earlier, about his mother's letter resting safely in his pack, and about the friend sitting beside him beneath the wide autumn sky. He realized that these shared moments had slowly shaped them all in ways they might only understand years later. When the lantern finally dimmed and the soldiers prepared for sleep, Thomas took one last look at the stars above the dark hills. Something about that peaceful autumn night gave him a quiet sense that the long journey they had been traveling was slowly approaching its final chapter. Though the future remained uncertain, he felt calm knowing that whatever lay ahead, the memories they had created together would remain with him for the rest of his life, like gentle lights guiding him long after the road itself had faded into the distance. The distant whistle of a train slowly faded from Thomas Walker's memory as he returned to the quiet evening on his porch. The sky above the countryside had grown darker now, and the first stars were shining softly between the drifting clouds. For a few moments he simply sat there, listening to the calm sounds of the night, the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint hum of insects in the grass, and the steady ticking of time that seemed to move more gently in places like this. The cup of tea beside him had gone cold, but he did not mind. His thoughts had traveled a long road that evening, moving carefully through memories that had waited patiently for many years. The young soldier who had once stepped onto that early morning train felt very distant now. Yet Thomas could still recognize pieces of that young man within himself. The friendships, the quiet journeys, the small moments shared beneath wide skies, they had all become part of the person he had slowly grown into over the decades. He remembered Daniel's warm laughter echoing across the training yard, Michael's careful sketches capturing ordinary moments, and Robert's calm presence during long walks through unfamiliar hills. Time had carried them all in different directions after those distant days, yet the memory of their companionship remained as clear as the evening stars above him. Thomas reached into the pocket of his old jacket and carefully unfolded a small, worn envelope. Inside was the letter his mother had written so many years ago, the paper now soft with age but the handwriting still gentle and familiar. He read the final lines again, the same lines that had once comforted him during uncertain days far from home. She had written that wherever life might lead him, he would always carry a piece of home within him. Sitting there on the quiet porch, Thomas realized how true those words had been. Home was not only a place, it was also the people, the memories, and the quiet lessons gathered along the way. The war itself had long ago faded into the distant background of his life, but the small human moments surrounding it had remained bright and meaningful. As the evening deepened into night, Thomas carefully folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. A soft breeze moved across the fields, carrying the cool scent of autumn through the darkening air. In the distance, the faint lights of neighboring houses glowed like tiny lanterns scattered across the land. Thomas leaned back in his chair and looked once more at the wide sky above him. The long journey of his memories had gently come to rest, like a train finally arriving at its quiet station after traveling through many landscapes. There was a peaceful completeness in that feeling, a calm understanding that life, much like the stories he carried within him, moved forward one quiet chapter at a time. And as the stars slowly brightened over the sleeping countryside, the old veteran closed his eyes for a moment, resting comfortably in the quiet knowledge that every memory, both distant and near, had helped shape the long, thoughtful road he had walked.